But it is now time for us to move on to the last session for day 3 of GADMAC. And it's my absolute pleasure to invite and welcome Assistant Professor Nidhi Rajput from the Nanajai Deshmukh Veterinary Science University in India, and please feel free to correct me on that, who's presenting again on wildlife conservation principle approach to prevent the biological disasters. The other thing I will mention is some basic housekeeping. We've got the chat feature disabled, so if you've got questions, use that Q&A session. And when you leave today's session, you'll be asked to participate in a short evaluation, and we encourage you to do that. We do have some information up on our LinkedIn and Facebook pages, and we encourage you to share information about the conference using the hashtag GADMCONF, and that will help us get the message out. People can still register for the conference. But without further ado, it's my pleasure to welcome our speaker today to talk about her topic on wildlife conservation, Dr. Nidhi Rajput. We welcome you to GADMAC.
Thank you very much, Stephen. This is Nidhi Rajput from Nanaji Deshmukh Veterinary Science University, and very warm greetings to everyone who is attending this presentation. So before moving forward, I want to submit a little note that we usually discuss about the management of disaster when it already has happened. But when we consider the biological disasters, then we all can definitely work together to prevent it. And based on that, I'm going to present about the wildlife conservation and how it can be considered a principal approach to prevent the biological disasters in any ecological settings. So wildlife is such a broad term. It includes everything which is free. Non-domesticated fauna, uncultivated flora. It includes insects, plants, animals, humans, everything. So, but in this presentation, whenever I'll be talking about the wildlife, I'll be addressing the wild animals as well as wild birds. So there are certain types of disasters, but when we talk about the biological disasters, then it has the organic origin, and it can be defined as the devastating effects caused by any living organism. And it can be bacteria, it can be virus, or it can be toxins. So these are the microorganisms. And I'll be discussing about the biological disasters which had happened in past and going on right now in the form of epidemics and pandemics, and especially I'll be focusing over the viruses. So human-made changes, climate changes, everything, it is all together. They are all changing the environment, and this is actually leading to the emerging of many infectious diseases, and especially the emerging viral diseases. These are the major threats to public health, especially the viruses in the past from wildlife hosts have emerged and had deep impact on the human population as well as in the animal population, such as SARS and Ebola fever. And if we talk about the current COVID-19 pandemic. So usually, if wildlife is there in the scenario, then it is a common belief that wildlife is usually healthy. It doesn't have any disease, or this is just a part of its ecosystem, so it is not going to harm anyone. But now when we are interfering the ecological settings, there are human-made interventions. So these interventions have changed the scenarios. And these scenarios are in the form of translocation, reintroduction programs, and many such events like deforestation, changing agricultural practices. So these are all actually leading to the disturbance in the equilibrium, which is created by the wildlife in this ecosystem. So when there is the increased involvement of wildlife in livestock or human diseases, then there are many factors, but most of the factors are anthropogenic, and these can be categorized into two. First, it can be increased interest in wildlife. That means increased popularity of wildlife. That means keeping them as pets. So, for example, the monkeypox outbreak in USA, which was caused by the pet prairie dogs, and those dogs were prairie dogs were actually got the infection while the commercial channels from Ghana. So this is one reason, and another is the encroachment of human settlements and their livestock, their croplands into the wildlife habitat, which is disturbing the whole system, and and actually exposing the environment for the multiplication of many such viruses which were there in the inside the ecosystem interior. So when discuss that wildlife conservation, why it is necessary, then obviously it is there to maintain the equilibrium in the ecosystem. But with the loss of habitat and with the loss of biodiversity, the protecting shell, which was actually previously was covering the wildlife, is disturbed. And there are ways for the uh, uh, unnecessary flow of the resources into the ecological settings, which is resulting into epidemics and also biological disasters in many cases. So the role of wildlife in biological disasters or the viral host switching was highlighted by the avian epizootic of high pathogenicity strains of H5N1 influenza A virus in the year 2003, in which the virus, it caused mortality and morbidities in several species of birds, and it also spilled over to the human population and resulted into deaths. So, for the viral host switching, mostly the enzootic and enzootic and epizootic viruses of the animals are considered the origin for these epidemics or even pandemics. But interestingly, these viruses were unrecognized before their actual emergence into the human population or in the livestock population. And one such example is HIV/AIDS, which was, I mean, the host switching might have occurred around 70 years ago, but when it appeared in the human population, only then we could see its drastic effects. And also some other human viruses like measles and smallpox might also have originated from the livestock or wildlife before their actual emergence in the human population. So when we discuss about the cross-species transmission or biological disasters, then usually the wildlife is considered as the primary source of infection. But this is factual that wildlife is there in a very limited area. It is there, its ecosystem, in its ecological setting, and which is sufficient for its survival, for its thriving. But there is the boundary between the wildlife and livestock and human. So when this boundary, this ecosystem boundary is disturbed, then it results into epidemics or biological disasters. So there is this concept of ecotone. Ecotone is actually the transition zone between the two adjacent ecological systems. It is an area where most of the biological and ecological activities are intensified, and there is the interaction of many species of both the ecological settings. So it can be considered as a zone where the human settlements, croplands, pasture lands, they extend deep into the forest area, intact forest block. So the problem is human created ecotones. These are extending deep into the intact forest blocks and causing the disturbances. For example, the tropical forest over the Ecuador, Central and West Africa are eroded to a point that only the core of the Central Africa is a regional scale ecotone. And as well as the population growth and pressure on natural resources have transformed Southeast Asia to a certain extent that the ecotones are more extensive than the natural forest areas. So it results into biodiversity loss, and biodiversity loss is actually the reason behind the viral pathogen emergence. Studies have indicated that between 1940 and 2004, over 300 emerging disease events were identified in humans around the world. And this is not the end, it is kept on increasing. So based on these facts, I'm going to discuss some biological disasters under different ecological settings. And first is Ebola virus disease. It is a zoonotic disease caused by Ebola virus species. And after its epidemic in African continent, a lot of research work has been done. And documentations by those research work indicates the significant link between the deforestation and disease outbreak. So this is this bat. Bat, they according to those studies that bat is the reservoir host for this Ebola virus. So deforestation and changing agricultural practices have caused the change in the abundance and behavior of this host. So to study this hypothesis, Olero and co-workers, they worked on this area. They worked over there where the Ebola outbreaks were happened, and they studied the bat population over there, and they found that the bats were serologically linked to this virus. And then they studied the deforested areas, and they found that there is the positive influence of deforestation on these bats, and most of the bats were there. I mean, the Ebola outbreaks were those happened in the deforested areas. So they clearly indicated that deforestation, or we can say the positive human influence on those bats, which were actually the reason behind these outbreaks. Second example is AIDS. AIDS right now is the most serious public threat around the world. It was first recognized in early 1980s, and it is also a zoonotic infection. It has been observed that it was the host switching of the SIV, simian immunodeficiency virus, from the non-human primates into humans. And there are two HIV, HIV-1 and HIV-2. HIV-2 is restricted to West Africa, but HIV-1 is global, and it has its closest simian relatives in chimpanzees and gorilla. So, unlike HIV-infected humans, the SIV-infected non-human primates are usually asymptomatic, but they have a high level of viremia that can result into cross-species transmission. However, the exact conditions and pathways for this cross-host exposure is not very clear, but human exposure to the blood and other secretion of the infected animals during the hunting and butchering for the bush meat can be a potential source for this infection. And its studies have also shown that 90% of the old world primate species are SIV infected. But this is not a new practice. I mean, this bush meat hunting is not a new practice over there. It is a long-standing practice in rural households in the sub-Saharan Africa. But with the time, gradually, with the use of firearms, there was the increase in the hunting. And then because of the commercial logging and road constructions, the human, they were able to enter the forest areas which were inaccessible earlier. So this resulted into more exposure to this virus and gradually establishment of this virus in the human population. And now with the global movement of human, it is a fear that now a new combination of SIV and HIV can be emerged anywhere in the world, even far, far away from the place from where it was earlier emerged. It was first emerged. So third is West Nile virus infection. It is related to the loss of biodiversity. Actually, it was first observed in Uganda, but it was not fatal in human. But its initial outbreak in USA resulted into deaths in human population. And by 2004, it became endemic in those states. So establishment and transmission of this virus is dependent on several factors, but most important factors are avian hosts, competent avian hosts, and mosquitoes that can feed on both birds as well as on the human. So studies reveal that passeriform birds are the most competent host for this virus. And also for this viral infection, the conditions were very much variable across the USA. In some provinces, it was very much prevalent, but in some cases, in some provinces, the cases were zero. So to study it more, Zenwa and co-workers, they studied the association between the bird biodiversity, and viral infection rates in the mosquitoes. So they found that the states, the provinces where there was biodiversity and wherever there are more bird species, the infection was very low. So they could conclude it that the non-passeriform birds, they were actually the incompetent host for this virus. So they acted as a dead-end host, and it resulted into the reduced infection in the mosquitoes and further reduction in the transmission to human population. So this is actually the dilution effect, which is the result of rich biodiversity. Because if there are more bird species, so there will be some dead-end hosts which can dilute this infection and may prevent its further spread to other population, other species. So now the bat coronaviruses, it is in trend these days. Bats are the reservoir species of many such coronaviruses, inclusive of SARS coronavirus as well as the recently COVID-19 pandemic, that means the novel coronavirus. But research and studies are going on how it became fatal and how it actually switched the host from the bat to the human or to other animals. It is going on. But this is sure that it was because of the more exposure to the bats. And obviously, it was the result of more human intervention, more exposure of human population to these wild species. So this is not only limited to the human population or any specific population, but also the wild species are also being affected. A classic example of this is tuberculosis and white-tailed deer. It is a very old example, but this can always be considered if we want to understand how the viruses can switch to a new host because of us, because of humans. So the white-tailed deer, they were never the endemic host for the tuberculosis, and there were few cases of spillover of this infection from the cattle population. But because of the start of the hunting clubs, the hunters, they started to raise deer in their farm, and also they applied fencing, and this resulted into the increase in the population of white-tailed deer, and also it exceeded the carrying capacity of that land. And also they started to raise cattle in those farms. So there was a two-way transmission of tuberculosis, and finally the tuberculosis, it became endemic in those deer herds, and also these deer started to transmit it back, spill back to the cattle population. So this was all human made. Although they could control it, but it actually complicated the tuberculosis control program in those regions for that time. And second is the canine distemper. It is a canine distemper, but in Serengeti National Park, it resulted into large-scale mortalities in African lions. And about 1/3 of the population got wiped out. And it took 4 years for population to cover. And also in Russian tigers. In India we are reporting canine distemper in tigers and leopards. And around 2 years back, it was reported in Asiatic lions. Asiatic lions are the only surviving population of its species. But all the studies and evidences have suggested that the domestic dogs or the feral dogs or the dogs which are there in the periphery of those protected areas are the potential reservoir for this infection. And this is the result of ecotone, increased ecotone. Because of that ecotone, the dogs, they are getting chances to interact with these big cats, with these wild carnivores, and they are spreading the infection to these precious wild animals. So human interventions have resulted into the cross-species transmission of these viruses, and one such example is brucellosis. In Yellowstone National Park, there are major wild herbivores, one bison and another elk. Bison is the reservoir of this disease, but elk is not, because of the behavioral differences between both the herbivore species. Bison, they usually calve in the group and in the close proximity of their herd members. So this attracts the attention of other members of the herd and also the calves, and they come and lick and sniff the placental membrane and calves. So this results into the maintenance of this disease in those herds. But in case of elk, they their calving is in isolation and they stay away from their herd for a couple of days, even weeks, and they readily eat all the placental membranes. So elk is not the reservoir, but bison are there acting as the reservoir of this disease. But no disease outbreak were observed in cattle population which were associated with the bison range. It was because the bison had the habit to graze away from the cattle population. But in the southern part of the greater Yellowstone area, there were sudden epidemics of brucellosis in cattle. And elk were identified as the source of infection. But this was the question that elk, those are not the reservoir of this brucellosis. Then how come they are transferring this disease to cattle population? So this was actually again the human intervention, because to keep the elk away from the cattle, the farmers, they started to offer supplemental feeding to these elk species, and this resulted into congregation of this species and then the multiplication, amplification of the brucellosis in these animals, and that resulted into its transfer to the cattle. So the practice which was actually adopted to keep the elk away from the cattle feed line actually resulted into the transmission of this disease to livestock. Second is the Nipah virus infection. Nipah virus, it is there in the bats, and bats are actually subclinically infected, and they do shed the virus, but bats, they are very much limited to their habitat. So if we are not going to disturb those species, they are not going to harm us. But with the integrated farming system, what happened? They started to cultivate fruit trees around the protected areas. So that agriculture system attracted the bats, and bats were there in those fruit tree farms, and at the same time the farmers, they were raising the pigs in those areas. So pigs, they were eating the leftover fruits by the bats, and this way the virus entered the pig population, and pigs, they acted as the amplifier host for this virus. So the virus rapidly spread through the pig population, and when the humans, they got exposure to these pigs, they got infected. So here, the integrated farming system and then the increased ecotone, deforestation, it all resulted into such a deadly virus infection in human population. So based on this, we are working here in central India, especially in the state of Madhya Pradesh. We are working on epidemiology of some important viral diseases, and these are canine distemper and tuberculosis. And we are including every species over there in that ecological setting, right from the wild animals, domestic animals, as well as humans. That we are at a very early stage, and we are not only doing the field studies, we are also taking the help of advanced techniques like molecular techniques to go further for genomic studies to observe that if the strains which are there in the wild animals are different from the strains which are already existing in the livestock. So this work is, we just have started. So I hope we will be able to bring some more results from this study. So now when we work on the field, and sometimes the question is very common, this question is very common. If we identify the wildlife reservoir, can we cull it? Can we remove it? And this question is very common in the countries where the economy is largely based on the livestock industries. But this cannot be done. There are negative implications, and this can be understood by the practice which was very earlier adopted in Great Britain to to control the tuberculosis in cattle population. They started to cull the badgers. Badgers were the source of infection to cattle population, but culling actually increased into the incidence of tuberculosis in those cattle population, and this was termed as social perturbation or perturbation effect. because we don't know the ecology of that reservoir species. So these badgers were actually the social animals. They live underground and they spend most of their time in the burrows, and these burrows are termed as sets. So when they started to cull the badgers, some badgers were left out and they started to wander, and they entered into non-infected badger sets, and they infected those badgers also. And this way, there were more infected badgers and more cases of tuberculosis in cattle population. So this was much earlier, but this clearly indicated that it is not easy to remove the reservoir from the ecosystem. Instead, it is never recommended to remove them. So we cannot remove them, but then the question is there, is wildlife there in every biological disaster? Then the answer is yes, it is there, because in most of the epidemics and pandemics, wildlife has been observed as a source of infection. But at the same time, we must not forget that the wildlife is an integral part of our ecosystem, and they are very much sensitive to changes which are made by the human, or there are some climate changes. So they are very much sensitive, and this wildlife can be considered as the miner's canary. That means any case or any infectious organism, if it is there, it will first appear in the wildlife, and then in the domestic animals, and then in the human population. So with the increased human intervention, human encroachment, we can think of more surveillance in the wildlife population through passive surveillance or active surveillance. But we need to find the cases in the wild animals, and we should never miss any opportunity to do these surveillance. And periodic surveillance has been very much recommended to find out the case in wildlife population, so that rapid response system can be created to control the same in domestic animals as well as in human population. So if we look into these data, then this is actually the worldwide emergence of diseases. So half of the disease emergence is the result of biodiversity loss. And earlier also I discussed about the dilution effect, because biodiversity has a role to play to dilute the infection. And how? Because in a much biodiverse country or in a much biodiverse ecosystem, there will be so many species. Some species may act as dead-end host, some species may be reservoirs, some species may be incompetent host. So these species will actually dilute the infection in that ecological setting. So the biodiversity in any ecosystem hence is acting as a protecting shield for every one of us. So to conclude, I would say that these biological disasters can be prevented by limiting the context between the reservoir host as well as the potential new communities. We can reduce the interventions to prevent these biological disasters. And then this concept of ecotone should be understood very well, because with the human intervention, increased human interventions, we are increasing the ecotone, and ecotone is actually providing a space for the pathogens to thrive, to give them opportunity to switch the host to infect a new population. And also, I would say that the wildlife perspective of biological disasters can be utilized to, to reduce the culling of reservoir species, especially the wildlife species, because every species has a role to play in the ecosystem. And extinction or alteration of any species will result into such epidemics or pandemics, and this will harm the whole ecosystem. So now the time has come for us to understand what is more important, ecology or economy. So this is all from my side. I want to acknowledge my organization, School of Wildlife Forensic and Health, Nanaji Deshmukh Veterinary Science University, and State Forest Department of Madhya Pradesh for providing all the support to carry out these investigations. And at the end, I want to thank the organizers for providing me this platform to speak on this topic. Thank you.
Well, what a fascinating presentation. I really enjoyed how you managed to take what could be quite complicated veterinary information and convey it in such a easily understood sort of fashion. Not everyone probably has your background that has joined us today, and I think you've done a tremendous job. A number of things such as the ecotone expansion and some of the other illustrations I just found really, really fascinating. We do have a few questions. One was around what are the importance of bats for wildlife conservation, and how can we reduce the disease in wildlife from domestic animals or vice versa?
Okay, first about the bats. Bats are there in their burrows. They are not going to come out. If they are coming out, then they are going to have their food and then they're back to their burrows. But the bats, they are spreading the disease when we are taking them out of their ecosystem. We are disturbing their ecosystem. So that way they are going to spread the infection because they are reservoirs. They have n number of viruses, and they are carrying these viruses for the sake of humanity, I must say, because they are preserving these viruses inside their little tummy. So if we disturb them, if we take them out, then it is obvious that they are going to spread the infections. We are going to kill them. Then what can happen? The disease emergence will be there in other population, in other species. And secondly, how can we spread the infection from wild animals to domestic or vice versa? Then obviously I discussed about the ecosystem boundary. There is a boundary between the two ecosystems. If we don't disturb this boundary, then obviously there will be no exposure of any of the hosts to new viruses. So it is very simple. The topic says wildlife conservation. We need to conserve the wildlife. We need to provide a safer space for these species, for these wild species, so they can thrive over there. And then they are not going to come out and spread the infection. And also, if boundary is maintained, domestic animals are not going out inside of those ecosystems. So this way, I mean, this sounds a little hypothetical, but this is a fact, and we should consider it. Now the time has come that we should think about it.
And do you think that people aren't taking this issue seriously? I mean, I know with there's certainly some discussion around COVID-19's origins, but do you think people aren't taking it seriously because sometimes people also don't have a bond with these animals, like the bats and some of the other hosts? I mean, if we were looking at some of these diseases or viruses affecting companion animals, would that change things? I'm just sort of thinking that with COVID-19, quite early on, I don't know if you recall, but there was occurrences in some countries where people were throwing their companion animal cats out the window from high-rise buildings because they thought that they would be a host for COVID. So I just sort of wonder about, we've framed it about wildlife, but I also wonder about how we have that relationship with domestic animals. And you did touch that they can be the interface between the two, but I'm just sort of interested to know really about how companion animals in particular can be a risk, but also can be a motivator for public opinion being changed about the needs to change.
Actually, see, I mean, the people, they are ignorant. I would say they are ignorant if they are thinking so. But there are chances. I mean, this diseases can be spread in any way. But if we consider the COVID-19 pandemic, then it was total misuse of knowledge. They could not understand that what is the reason behind this pandemic. And animals, they are like in previous uh, presentations also, they consider the animals as property. They don't they don't consider them as living beings. So
Mm.
this is the result of all these misconceptions. This can easily be prevented. Like for bats, here when it just started, everyone was saying that these bats are the source of this infection. No, they were carrying the infection to save you. It was you who took them out. And for the companion animals, no, I don't think that. And yeah, I would say that here the veterinarians have a role to play. They know the exact epidemiology, the exact ecology of that disease. They should come forward and let people know how the disease is there, how the disease is occurring in an ecosystem, and how the role of companion animal over there. I mean, it is over there. So to remove all these thoughts, to remove all these misconceptions, the scientific community should come forward and interact more with the common people, with the general public. I hope I answered it well, or if
You did, and I think I was going to sort of build on that around the role of veterinarians. I mean, I know that Mel Taylor's sort of research, looked at who is the trusted source for information during emergencies, and veterinarians and fire and rescue people were ranked pretty high. So having a trusted source of information is really important for the public. So I mean, even with sort of COVID, do you think veterinarians, and I think you've already answered this question, but I'm taking that you're suggesting that veterinarians and those associations, the veterinary associations, need to sort of step up and be a bit more sort of pushy about pushing this topic, because even now during this global pandemic, it seems to be very human centric.
Yes, they should, and they already have started. Yeah, but at a that the number is not more, but gradually, I'm sure, because many of my colleagues, they are speaking about it with the general public. They are publishing the articles, the popular articles, and they are coming forward. And I think it will be there. The veterinarians, they are coming forward, and they will definitely aware the general public regarding the same.
I can't wait till we share your video with the rest of the world to encourage people to better understand the issues. Look, I've got a few other sort of questions here. One is from Veronica, who's congratulating you for a fantastic and fascinating presentation.
Thank you.
She was asking whether you'd be able to expand on the methods that you're using, and also are there studies on relating this kind of biological disaster and wildfires and diseases that spread after the aftermath of wildfires? So a few questions there. Maybe the first one is about maybe the methods you're using.
I'm really sorry. I mean, if you can please repeat the question, or
Sure. Sorry, I'll speak a bit clearer. From Veronica, she was wondering if you can expand on the methods that you are using for your study.
Mm-hmm. For my studies, or because there are two sections of this presentation. One is what I'm doing right here in my institute, and another I quoted from other researchers. So yes, definitely expansion of these methods will definitely help. And what I could understand, that the wildfire was a result of it was not the result of, sorry, yeah. So it was not the result of any epidemic. It was totally a different kind of disaster. So biological disaster, definitely we can use these techniques. But for other kind of disasters, we should think more over, I mean, more on the topics which can help to give more information for those disasters. But yeah, definitely, I should think over it. I should think over it. Thank you so much for this question, because this biological disaster is totally a different thing, and wildfire, it is actually making me confused. Yeah, this should be considered, and I will definitely think over that. And thank you so much for this question.
And sometimes there's no short answer as well. So I appreciate that. Another question was, how do we control the ecotone expansion in the wild? How do we control the ecotone expansion in the wild?
Oh, this is actually ecotone. What is ecotone? It is the cropland. It is the pastureland. It is just the human-made system. So what would I say? Deforestation. We need to work on that. Deforestation and the agriculture system. We are changing it. We are going towards the integrated farming system. We should think over it, and this way we can definitely decrease the ecotones. Because if ecotones are less, obviously there will be less space for the host exposure to other viruses. So ecotones is totally I mean, reduction of the ecotone is totally dependent on the human. So this is all. I mean, policymakers should think about it, and we as a scientists, we should raise this issue to let them think about it.
Brilliant. And more people are just saying what a great presentation, which is fantastic to see. I think probably heading towards our final question is, what should be the major components of a sound pandemic epidemic preparedness and response plan? And do you think that India as a country is well prepared for future pandemics? And if it's not, what's your suggestions?
Pandemic is, whenever there is pandemic, it is going to affect globally. So we should think at a broader level. But yeah, if I talk about India, if I talk about my country, then research work has already been started. The veterinarians are involved in those research works, like we are doing here, our part in central India, in the state of Madhya Pradesh, though we are limited to the protected areas, but we have started to work on that. And this will definitely take time, because this is just the initiation of an idea. Now, if we have got the idea, now we need to work on that. And I hope in future, everyone will work together to achieve this objective, to keep the wildlife safe in their habitat, and to keep ourselves safe in this planet, because this is the only planet we are going to share. So I would rather say that yes, mentally we are all ready to face next any epidemic or pandemic. Now we have got the idea, and we are working on it, and we will definitely achieve the goal.
That is fantastic, and not only has your presentation been fascinating, it's been inspirational. I think it certainly acts as a motivation to clearly that we've got to change how we interact with these other systems as humans. We're the ones that have got the power to do something different, not the animal. So we've got to step up, not them. Thank you very much, Assistant Professor Rajput, for joining us today at GADMAC. It's been fantastic having you, and I'm sure everyone else has had a fascinating session. So thank you for your presentation, and we look forward to where your research goes in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for joining. I bid you farewell, and we look forward to seeing you, for those that will join us in the morning or whatever time zone, for day 4. And in the theme of pandemics and COVID, our first up speaker or speakers is Dr. Sarah DeYoung and Dr. Ashley Farmer, who's looking at the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on community-based animal programs in the US. So thanks for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you on day 4 of GADMAC. 6 days to go. Thanks for joining us.